I'm David Ferriero. I'm the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the William G. McGowan Theater for tonight's discussion about the ways people use and enjoy public parks. But before we start the program, I'd like to tell you about two programs coming up in this theater next week. On Tuesday the 17th at noon, Cokie Roberts and Max Bird will discuss the letters of Clover Adams, the wife of Henry Adams. Clover is a Washington salon, hosted celebrated politicians and writers, and her perceptive letters expose Washington life and politics in the Gilded Age. At noon the next day, Adam Goodhart presents a gripping account of how the Civil War began in his book 1861, The Civil War Awakening. Washington's origin as a deliberately planned city sets it apart from most American cities. L'Enfant, the first of many Washington city planners, laid out a pattern of public spaces among the streets where people would live and conduct business. Our largest public space, the National Mall, has always been a focal point of the capital city. Visitors and residents assume that the mall today looks as it always has looked, but maps and plans here at the National Archives show us how that iconic space has changed since L'Enfant's day. And we're still examining changes to the mall, looking back to the historical records and anticipating future uses of this space. Tonight's program, presented in partnership with the National Capital Planning Commission, is a companion event to the National Mall Design Competition to redesign three spaces on the mall: Union Square, the Washington Monument Grounds at Sylvan Theater, and Constitution Gardens. It's the first of a series of presentations by influential policymakers, thinkers, and practitioners in the fields of urban planning, architecture, design, and the arts. It's now my pleasure to introduce Marcel C. Acosta, Executive Director of the National Capital Planning Commission. Mr. Acosta has more than 25 years of experience in urban and transportation planning. As Executive Director of the federal government's Central Planning Agency, he oversees a team of urban planners, architects, historic preservationists, and other professionals who are committed to preserving and enhancing the extraordinary qualities of the National Capital Region. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Marcel Acosta.
Well, good evening, everyone. We really have a terrific program tonight. I had the opportunity to sit with our panelists earlier today, this evening, and I think you're in for a big treat. But first of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Ferriero and his staff from the National Archives for welcoming us to this gorgeous auditorium. And also like to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's event, Caroline Cunningham and her team at the Trust for the National Mall, as well as Caroline Nagel of the City Parks Alliance, who worked with us in putting together tonight's program. Tonight, what we want to do tonight is really engage all of you in thinking about our parks and public spaces and what they could be in the future. So on behalf of the National Capital Planning Commission and our partners, I'd like to thank you for joining us here tonight. The spark for tonight's program, as the archivist mentioned earlier, was really the Trust for the National Mall and the design competition that they are currently conducting for 3 sites on the mall itself. Caroline will talk about the competition a little bit at the end of tonight's program. The competition finalists are here in Washington tonight, and many have joined us in the audience. So I do want to extend a very warm welcome to all of them. Our panelists will also be sharing ideas about public space from across the country. And we also hope that tonight's panel discussion will provide new perspectives about the possibilities for public spaces today and in the future. So we really hope that their ideas really inspire us about what Washington's parks and public spaces can become. We do have a great legacy of historic parks and open spaces like the National Mall, the L'Enfant plants, our Fort Circle Park system. Many of our playgrounds, our streets, our plazas are very important to the city, both from a federal standpoint as well as a local standpoint. But really, this is a good opportunity to really reimagine what those spaces can become and what they could become in this next century. So we do need to balance both, and that's really something we're very interested in listening to tonight from our panelists. And from our agency standpoint, we do this every day in terms of trying to balance those needs. So it'd be really interesting to hear about how we could really try these very innovative techniques here in Washington, D.C. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jason Schupbach, tonight's moderator. Jason is the Director of Design at the National Endowment for the Arts, and has been actively involved in the intersection of placemaking and the arts. So please join me in welcoming Jason Schupbach.
Thank you so much, Marcel, and welcome everyone. I'm very honored to be here tonight with all of our esteemed panel, our competition design team guests, and all of our wonderful attendees. The NEA has a long history of supporting design and the role of the arts in public space, including many design competitions. We've had a hand in everything from the Maya Lin Vietnam War Memorial to the new relatively new Seattle Olympic Sculpture Park. When Chairman Rocco Landisman arrived at the NEA in 2009, he really sparked a national conversation around what we call creative placemaking. Creative placemaking, the way we define it at the NEA, is how communities use the arts and design to strategically shape their social, physical, and economic characters. This conversation was really built on the NEA's legacy with the Mayor's Institute on City Design and the Citizens Institute on Rural Design, in which mayors and county executives have been using the design and arts for years to help revitalize communities. These civic leaders were eager for additional federal support and investment to support this work, so we created a new grant program called Our Town. Our Town is really a creative placemaking grant program which invests in partnerships between local governments and arts organizations. Our Town's inaugural round of grants invested in many innovative public space ideas. There was an awesome project in Fargo, North Dakota, where they have these flood basins that they had to build because of the awful flooding in 2000 that really tore up neighborhoods. And we invested in rethinking those spaces into public spaces and community commons. And really beyond the NEA, even the foundation world has really sort of taken up the mantle of creative placemaking. So why the NEA PSA, real quick? Why I brought all this up is that the enormous response we've had from across the country around creative placemaking really shows that communities want to rethink their public spaces. There is just a surge in hunger from communities across the country to look at a lot of these issues. So tonight's conversation could not be more imperative. We're excited to, as Marcel said, we're excited to have many of the design competition teams here tonight, but we really want to have a broader conversation. Tonight's event, as you can see, is titled Revolutionary Parks, the Future of Public Space. So tonight is about ideas. We're going to explore the important ideas shaping public space now and into the future. And our panelists are also going to share their experiences in moving from idea to actually doing. How do you build interest over the long term? How do you find the resources to make this happen? And how do you find a way forward amidst competing interests? While the National Mall and Washington Parks will be part of tonight's conversation, we will be addressing issues relevant for the entire country. As cities revitalize and attract more people, our urban public spaces are becoming more critical as places to relax and play, express your opinion, celebrate, and commemorate. So across the US and around the world, there are many new exciting urban parks that have been created, as well as new approaches to how to revitalize well-loved public spaces. So true to our title, we want to talk about public spaces that are revolutionary parks, places that are new approaches to design, programming, use, and management, as well as explore evolutionary spaces. Get it, the R-E. It's a cool little graphic thing you guys do. At the evolutionary spaces, like how do you help historic spaces adapt to the new needs? So these wonderful panelists are already exploring public space at different scales. They're sparking public engagement through temporary installations and using new media to connect people and each other in these spaces. And they're transforming public space across the country, large and small. We're really honored to have them here tonight. So I'm going to ask the panelists questions that were collected from sponsors of the event, the panelists themselves, and from online. What will also happen is, I think hopefully when you all came in, there were cards that were handed out. At one point, probably around like 8:05, we're going to ask that you pass those cards down to the end. They'll be collected, and that will give us time to kind of sort through them, and we'll have a little bit of the time in the end to answer your questions from the crowd. In addition, NCPC will be posting all of the questions that they received online and from the crowd, and the panelists have offered their time up to answer those questions online too, so you will hopefully have a chance to get your questions answered. And the video of tonight's event will be available on NCPC's website in a few days. So you guys have already got the bio on these amazing speakers. I'm really going to ask each of our panelists to start with a question that will really kick us off. So let's please welcome them to the stage. John Bela, Tupper Thomas, and Theaster Gates. Let's give them a round of applause, please. I'm going to walk this way.
I'm not jumping that.
This is Tupper. This is John Bela.
I wore the same thing that was in the picture, so you'd all know.
Yeah, exactly. You think, perfect. All right, so I thought we should start off by giving people a little bit of perspective on some current work that you're excited about. It can help you kind of define your bio a little bit for the crowd. I'd like for each of you to take 2 to 3 minutes, to tell us a little bit about a project that you're excited about and how, hopefully it'll be a project that kind of relates to public space and the themes that we want to hit tonight. So Theaster, I'll ask you to start.
Sure. So I'm an artist and trained as an urban planner. The scale that I've worked at for a long time was either the museum scale, so 20 to 50 feet with an object in it, or the scale of the 2-flat, kind of thinking about abandoned buildings in poor black communities, Chicago, St. Louis, Omaha, Detroit. Just thinking about how those spaces, with a little bit of tweaking, could not just hold a family or 2 families, but might become small cultural centers in the absence of cultural centers. A project that I'm working on currently is trying to shift the scale from to 2-flat houses to 30 to 100 units, and really imagining what is the formula, what's necessary for an artist to have deep investment in a place, and who are the partners necessary, developers, the city. How can developers in the city finance people who know how to get deals done? How can I be part of the creative reinvestment of a place? And so we have our first project, which is a formerly abandoned 36-unit housing, low-income housing project that had been abandoned for about 5 years. We approached the city and asked if we could convert it into 36 units of affordable artist housing. And so this was the first time that we went from using private resources exclusively to leveraging new market tax credits and partnering with other organizations to think about the resources necessary to get the deal done, and then also some programming resources that would allow it to have some teeth for a long time.
Great, and I do want to come back to the issues of small-scale community spaces out in communities as we go through the conversation. Tupper, do you want to?
Yes. So I got to spend the last over 30 years restoring one of the most beautiful landscapes in the country, if not the world. But I'm not prejudiced about that. And it was very exciting to work in Prospect Park because it was a park that had a gorgeous structure to it, beautiful design, and at the same time, totally unused. Everybody was afraid to go in and all sorts of things. And so we worked on many, many things from the very beginning, but the first thing was to get people to love it and to want something to happen there. And that meant programming and better maintenance, more operations. And then we did a wonderful amount of restoration. And now we have the reverse issue of getting people to come back. We've got more people coming back than we can possibly handle and no money to maintain it. So, hey. But the project that has been the most exciting for me, because it's something I wanted to do from the very first day I started, is the removal of an old skating rink that was really, really unattractively placed in the middle of this beautiful landscape, tear it down and build a facility that was a year-round activity place for the people of Brooklyn. And I think that has been terrifically exciting because we were able to really stay true to the landscape design, but bring in a wonderful architect who was able to design a facility that can be used for skating and hockey and roller skating and water play and fun things, and it's completely hidden under mounds of dirt. So you don't see it, it isn't invasive in the landscape, but it is still completely a beautiful space and has added more parkland. So for me, that has been the most exciting thing to work on in the project that I did, because it brought more people of even more diversity to the park and really completed a piece that says that Prospect Park has come back and now is moving forward in a great way.
Fantastic. And we definitely want to get into the issues of money and maintenance tonight.
Yes.
So, John?
Thanks. So I'm a founder and principal of Rebar, and Rebar is an art and design studio focused on integrating people and place. I think we're most well known for our Parking Day project, which was a temporary installation that we started 6 years ago, which has evolved into a global event that people use to proclaim their interest for people, places, instead of parking spaces. That's now evolved into what was a sort of tactical action, has evolved into part of a strategic planning process that city planners are using in several cities across the country, which has become the Parklet program, so semi-permanent occupation of the parking lane to create new mini public parks. I think the thing that I'm most excited about working on now is a living street project in San Francisco. There's a great community market that happens in the Mission every Thursday night, and it's on sort of a derelict, beat-up street, and there's a really a big opportunity to sort of reclaim that space and create a wonderful new context for this market. So it's a really unique opportunity, and it's part of, I think, a broader movement about rethinking the way that we use streets in the city. You know, San Francisco, 25% of the city's land area is streets. That's larger than all the public parks combined, and so I think part of our work is sort of rethinking the way we think about streets as public space in the city.
Great, and absolutely, again, we do want to talk about temporary urbanism too tonight also. So you guys are hitting all the topics already, that's awesome. Let's start with one other general question to kind of get the conversation going. Tonight's really about the future of public space in the country. That's way too broad. So I'd like to ask each of you to talk about one trend that you think will be one of the most important trends that people need to pay attention to, or issues that people need to pay attention to going forward to kind of get the conversation going. Tupper, let's start with you.
To me, one of the most exciting things that's happening in the whole world of open space is partnering and partnerships that are happening with all kinds of other things, transportation, health, all the partnerships that need to happen to make our open spaces more appealing and even more useful. Arts, all of those things seem to be really moving ahead so that a park isn't seen as just a piece of open space where you recreate, but is really seen as a place for community, for your better health, for creating more things for transportation, non-car kind of transportation, right. And for getting people really to appreciate and be part of the community through their parks, both their health and their transportation and all those other kinds of things. I think the arts particularly is very exciting.
Let's stay on this topic for a second. I mean, a lot of your practice is about sort of cultural collision and the ways that people experience spaces in different ways that give them a new experience that may educate them and better them. And how do you see the quality and importance of partnerships in your work, Theaster?
Yeah, I think that in some ways, I definitely value partnerships, but I don't think that all partnerships work. That there are times when agencies aren't interested in working together, and there are times when the complements that you need, if you have a bad designer in a very wealthy agency, that's a disaster. So I'm really conscious of what partnership means, and the word partnership in general isn't my term, but one where there's kind of thoughtful partnership, thoughtful complement between institutions. But I also wanted to just kind of mention, to your point of the question about open space, that the future of it, I spend a lot of time thinking about monuments, and I think that DC is an important place to think about monuments. And the history of monuments, one way to read the history of monuments is that you build an object that has a very specific history associated with it, and then that monument symbolizes that into the future. And maybe one of the ways that I'm thinking about monuments these days is, instead of a monument being something that is born with a specific purposefulness, could the monument be instead a kind of vessel, a carrier? Lefebvre talks about this, a kind of carrier of whatever that moment is. So part of the reason that I think about buildings as monuments or architecture or, as a kind of monument is that it has the potential to accumulate stories in a way that some of our historical symbolic monuments don't have the ability to, because they were made for such a specific moment. So I think a lot about how architects could make homes for the accumulated story of a place.
Well, Well, I think that's really interesting, and you're hitting on a point that I wanted to bring up later, but we might as well go there now, is I hope people have seen the Michael Kimmelman article where he wrote about rethinking parking lots recently that was in the New York Times, and he talks about how do you design a space for the uses that are already there and the stories that people are already telling in that space. And I think there's a real tension there between that need to design for uses now, sort of the William White sort of theories, versus the kind of prescribed space that DC might also have those requirements. And I'd love to have John kind of speak a little bit about that, because you've been dealing a lot with temporary spaces and the movement from those temporary spaces to something that's a little more permanent. So let's talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, I think that to me is one of the most interesting trends that's happening these days, which is that there's all sorts of great design ideas out there. But I think what's changing today is the process by which new places are made. And this idea of temporary is actually evolving very quickly from temporary placemaking as an ad hoc solution when cities can't afford to do their sort of major public park investment to becoming a tool whereby planners work with artists, work with designers to create places using a new process. And I think the way I've started to think about that process is called iterative placemaking. So rather than go the sort of standard route of strategic planning where you do 10 years of planning, 5-year capital campaign, and then 3 years of construction, you do a phase one kind of intervention that is a physical way of testing ideas and engaging community in a way that we haven't done before. And that process of engagement actually gathers data that cities can use about incubating program, testing ideas about what programs are going to work. Because it's so difficult to predict and plan. What are people going to be doing in parks 10 years from now? I mean, certainly there's a baseline of activity which is going to be the same, but cities change so quickly. And social conditions emerge and disappear so quickly. So how can our parks and public spaces respond to the kind of social dynamism of cities? And I think one of the keys is really taking a hard look at the process by which places are made.
And it probably can't be that everything that we do is a temporary solution or everything that we do is a long-range plan. But is there a way that those two kind of time signatures could coexist so that as you're building the infrastructure for a light rail line that takes 20 years, that there's some thoughtfulness around what could happen at that site while the 20 years of long-range building is happening. And so, so that these things kind of coexist as reminders to the other and as informants.
Right. And your point about buildings and about architecture sort of being a repository of the stories of the past and the present and the future. I mean, there's also sort of an architectural manifestation of holding that capacity, which is one very simple example is a building floor plate. Right? Some building floor plates can accommodate an industrial use or can be converted back to residential housing. Well, we could think about building buildings that build on that use from the get-go so that as these uses change over time, it's not about rebuilding brick and mortar infrastructure.
Well, I'd like to get Tupper in here on this to talk about how these issues, you dealt with these issues in a historic landscape.
Right.
Because I think that's actually quite imperative for what happens in DC, and especially with the mall. I'm sure you've had to deal with a lot of the issues I've been talking about. I'd love to hear you jump
I
in.
think that one of the things that has been true is that if you can start with a basic great landscape, which the mall is actually, it's a great landscape, it's an exciting place to be. And then you design things that can be flexible. To me, the best part of Prospect Park was that it was such a flexible design that anything could happen in it. It's still as beautiful today as it was 150 years ago, but it's now being used for cricket and this and that and 15 other things, and art exhibitions can come and go from it because it was designed in such a way that it was always flexible and always beautiful to the people of the community. So it's involving the community, I think, in all of this is clearly significant and important to do, and getting their concepts. And of course, the mall has every kind of community because there's the Washington, D.C. community, there's the tourists, there's all the other folks, the actual institutions along it. So I'm sure there's many, many other kinds of issues that have to come into it. But to me, that's the most exciting thing to be thinking about is how can this space still fill all the needs of that group and still be a wonderful place to go.
I do want to come back to since this is a design conversation, there's many amazing designers sitting in the crowd here. What are some of those actual design things that led to flexibility? Because I think that could be quite informative. But let's talk for 2 seconds about community involvement and how you lead, because you were an amazing leader in involving the community and getting them bought into a space. I think one of the big issues in DC is that not everyone who lives in DC sees the mall as theirs.
Yeah.
And so how do you get those disengaged communities? You dealt with this issue.
Yes.
How did you make that happen? How did you lead?
There's many, many ways to do it, and I think you have to try all of them. One of them is to do as many special events.
Well, that's a simple answer.
Yes, yeah. Special events is a really good thing to get people to show off their culture for other people to watch. So whatever that is, if it's the Drummers Grove, if it's some other fabulous thing that people have to offer, the Chinese community coming in and inviting them to come, actually asking people to come so other people can watch and see them, and I think that's very important. I think the other thing is education. We actually spend a great deal of time going around to all of the schools in the area and having those kids come to the park through their school teachers, for environmental education or for whatever, but getting the kids out so they felt a connection to the park. So they said, oh, we went here and here. And it was so pretty because a lot of people think the park wasn't for them. They just felt as though maybe it was dangerous or whatever. The mall, I think people just feel like that's the mall. We don't go to the mall. Different malls people do go to, not that one. But I think through the education and libraries, you can get a lot of people who will come, and then I think you start some traditions that are for the community. So we started fireworks on New Year's Eve, very simple to do, and it's really only intended for locals. It's something that local people will do. A Halloween event, things like that.
Theaster, you've dealt with these issues involving the community on a very different scale. I'd love to hear you kind of jump in about the way that you've worked with communities and designing these almost sacred spaces in the communities, in a sense.
Well, I think to Tupper's point, there were multiple communities. There was a larger city in Chicago. There's the city that assumed that this area that I was working in was a dangerous, violent, prostitute-ridden place, that it was stigmatized from the outside. On the inside, there were really cool people who felt that this was home. And then there were folk who were, in some cases, in need of some of the resources of the city. And so kind of taking on these different views of this one particular place, I was like, oh, I have to figure out a way with my neighbors to increase the expectation of the city around this place. How do we make this place as seductive to be a part of, proud to be a part of as we can? And again, that came with some pretty basic programming. I cleaned out a building and I made sure that we had the best jazz in the city happening there, we had the best movies happening in backyards. I mean, it was just like really simple little things. But the fact that this place seems so obscure and already so diabolically wrong that it made it even sexier that those things were happening there, that the expectations were so low that that they were like, oh my God, a movie, wow, we have movies on the South Side, and so I think that it really started to show that there had been such neglect by the cultural community of the city in particular places that I think it just kind of it stood to shine a light in a way. And so while these outsiders were starting to get excited, the insiders were like, who are all these white people in my neighborhood? And so figuring out a way that that things were happening for insiders.
Yeah, exactly.
And saying, hey, y'all, it's Thursday. On Saturday, they coming. They're coming, and is there a way that we can be
Was that
hosts?
the movie, or was that the people?
Right. But really being, really accepting that in a place like Chicago, that there are these zones of tension and racialized, spatialized difference, and that one has to be willing to take that on as much as you're willing to take on the movie program or jazz venue.
So John, you have been very successful with little interventions having a big meaning, but I want you to talk a little bit about the digital community and how you have been Parking Day just went from here to there, like, unbelievably quickly. And how did that happen? And how did you engage the digital community, or did it happen around you? I mean, it'd be great to hear a little bit about that.
And I mean, I think there's just the broader cultural context of the development of social media and web and other communications tools. And so we simply sort of, we emerged into that context. But we made some very specific decisions about our projects, which was to make them open source. So with Parking Day, we shared images of the project, which spread rapidly throughout the internet. And people, it was such a simple idea that people sort of got it really quickly. And we got requests from around the world, people saying, hey, can you come do this in LA? Can you come do it in Italy? And we couldn't physically go to those places to do it. So we made a decision, let's make this open source. We created a how-to manual, basically sort of an IKEA-style guide to make your own park in a parking spot. And we published that on our website. And
Did you
within a
name
couple
it something
months,
funny like Verksterungen or something? Just
I think it was, just a very simple name, the Parking Day How-To Manual.
That's much better.
And,
He obviously hasn't bought anything.
Yeah, I say so. Yeah. Truly, yeah.
but within a couple weeks after doing that, people took the idea and started creating their own versions of this art installation. And so it became a sort of a piece of genetic code, actually, that was shared and then mutated and modified in these different contexts. It became a sort of meme, and it went viral, as they say, and spread around the globe. And what's been beautiful about that has been, we as artists and designers had our own sense of what we were trying to achieve with the project. But when something gets picked up and taken by, artists, designers, activists around the world, you can't believe the extent of the creativity, of invention, of transforming the idea into something new, which makes sense for that particular community in that context. And I think that's what's been really beautiful about the Parklet program, too. So Parklet is an official city program now in San Francisco, in Portland, and New York. Any cafe owner can get a permit now to remove a parking space and make a little mini public space. One of the things we really fought for with that program is that they be public spaces. So it's not just a further enclosure of the commons. It's not just an extension of commercial space. And with each project has a different designer, a different community. So you get this incredible diversity of approaches to kind of creating, how do you define a new public space? And it's also brought up for me really poignantly the difference between good design and not so good design, particularly when it gets down to making a space inviting to the public. There's many parklets that have a very private feel. And they're not inviting, and there's many of them that have a very public feel. So, I guess just back to your question, I think we did nothing unique relative to digital media. We're just sort of coming up in an era when these are the communication tools, and we took advantage of them. And then we made a specific decision to share the idea and make something open source.
Great. Well, I'm glad you touched on the issue of privately owned public space, because I think we'd be really remiss if we didn't have a conversation being in the National Archives about the First Amendment rights in public space and what's going on in public spaces right now, Zuccotti Park being a prime example. I want to talk, Gerald Caden brought this issue up years ago with his book, and it could not be more pertinent at the moment. I'd love to hear you guys speak about how do you design how do you make sure that you can design for those activities to take place? And also, what are the tensions right now and the tensions you foresee in the future around the fact that cities have no money and they're really looking for privately owned public spaces to possibly be a very real, become even a bigger trend in the future as opposed to, it's already huge in New York. So let's jump into this one a little bit. I'll ask Tupper to start here. So.
Okay. Actually, I've been thinking a lot about that because I went to so many marches on the Mall in my youth, and I was thinking of the Tent City. Was that what it was called? Those of you who are past 60? Well past 60, maybe? Yeah. So
I didn't have you a day over 25.
Yeah, and people actually lived in the mall and had tents and set it all up, and certainly all of the women's movement and the civil rights movements and everything really had their place. And public space has to be able to do that. Every movement across this country and probably across the world has been in the public parks. So really the way the mall is currently designed, it has some great spaces for public gatherings and protest. And it's really important. The actual rules of how you can do that and what the permit process has to be is a very specific one that is really about procedure. So in New York City, you cannot camp out or sleep in a city park. And so they picked Zuccotti Park, which was a public park that was owned privately and didn't have the same rules and regulations, and just moved in there. In Washington, all of those other things were given a permit to do what they had to do. So although design's an important part of it, management of the space is the other really big issue in this concept. I can't imagine that public parks shouldn't be places for public protest. It has to be a place where the public can go.
Yeah, this is a tough one for me, because I do think that, you know, a nation deserves the right to kind of laugh together and mourn together, but it also has the right to be critical of itself and of its government, and that there seems to be a trend that feels somewhat militaristic, that if there's an open critique of a certain sort, there's a chance that that critique is going to get shut down. And depending on who the owners of that land is and what they imagine as healthy public response, whatever it is, mourning, laughter, aggravation, we've seen lately around the world that there are ways in which the public kind of loses its right to convene. In both at a national level with thousands of people, but I experience this every day when young African American men are locked up for walking down the street because there's an absence of a certain kind of public space, and so you stroll, you know, or you convene on the corner, you know. And so I think that at every scale, I'm really conscious of not necessarily just who owns the space, but are these rules being set up in a way, this protocol, so that it takes away our ability to convene, our ability to express together a sentiment? And what can we do as designers and architects to preserve and fight not only for the spatial moment, but the political right? That it has to be both. We believe that this big grassy space is important, and we believe it for these reasons. And so what is the architecture then, not just the spatial architecture, but the character architecture, the social implication of these spaces? And how is that written in beyond the drawings that determine that the space should be such and such size? So what is the collaborative team that says, you know, how do we publicly mourn and protest the issue of war here? And then what right do we have to do that? And how are our rights infringed upon as a result of space being available or not available, or military police coming in, or so? So I think that I'm trying to just problematize the fact that we can make spaces as a form of social engineering. We can make them so that firefighters can get by and horses can get by. But what we're finding with Occupy is that no matter how much planning and designing we do, people have the ability to overtake the use of that space. And that becomes the radical political moment that's actually quite exciting. That we make our spaces, we do the best that we can, and then people overturn them. And I'm really excited that there's not enough designing that we can do to keep people from having a sentiment about what they believe in.
Thank you. John, do you want to jump in a little bit here and talk about how you're addressing these issues within your design practice?
Yeah, well, just a couple thoughts responding to what's been said before is that, I mean, as you guys were talking, a quote by Michel de Certeau came to mind, which is that space is a practice place, right? Which implies that how space is defined kind of socially, the guidelines, the rules, is in part defined by how we as the public decide to use those spaces. And I mean, it seems so interesting to me that the site of one of the sort of largest, most recent public protests in the country didn't happen in a public park. It happened in a privately owned public space because it just so happened that the codes defining that space were less restrictive than those of a public park. That's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, how can you protest? I mean, protest is an act of resistance. It's an act of finding, you know, you're moving your way around the sort of what is prescribed. And you know, protest isn't as meaningful if here's your place to protest. Here's your site where it's condoned from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. You can kind of use your voice and express your voice. That's not active protesting. So, you know, protesters are going to find those niches and loopholes to enable their voice to be heard. I think there's a great example of it from the Berkeley campus, actually, when Berkeley decided to shut down the protests to overnight tenting. They said, okay, great, this has been great, but now we're going to remove the tents and no more overnight camping. Well, a couple of Berkeley landscape students actually came up with the great idea of filling a tent with balloons. So suddenly the tent was lofted into the air. You know, so if we can't camp on the ground, we're going to camp in the sky, and it just became this wonderful, you know, symbol.
And they got sued for air rights.
Well, yeah, okay, right. So then it's the air rights.
Only in Berkeley.
But it became the symbol of resistance, and I think that's what's important. I don't know if you can design into a public space through an official planning process, you know, niches or loopholes for resistance, because people are always going to create that themselves. It's the act of how you use a space that defines it.
You know, this part also seems like it might be part Marcel's job, that there's a way in which then the administrators of parks then have to understand the complexity of public sentiment. Like I said, as much as we can, design for as much as we can, and design for them to be beautiful places of awe and wonder and celebration and festivity, that we also understand that that we have the responsibility as good space administrators to be sensitive to all of the emotional care of our people.
And actually maybe even putting in to a space places so that you can have water run through, and you could have electrical hookups just the way you would if you wanted to have entertainers come. But you could have something that would say, you know, you can do this. But I do think it loses some of its spontaneity to not be able to simply say, I'm a citizen of the United States and I'm upset about this, and I'm going to go and I'm going to try to protest on whatever grounds I can. But it will be, I think, very interesting to see if we say, okay, well, with a permit, you can do this much. And I think all of the events on the mall have had permits. So even the Tent City things had a permit from the Park Service, and were able to come in and they set up their tents and they did the whole thing. So, you know, even in that case, we're used to saying it's a democracy and you can protest, but you have to protest with a permit. And it's just whether that permit can be turned down for reasons like overnights or not overnights, because it does take some spontaneity out of it.
You know, I think just back to the design question for a second. I think, you know, the design community really quickly falls into a trap, which is thinking that there is one public to design for. And you brought this up, Theaster, right? In Chicago, you're working with multiple publics, right? There is no such thing as a public space for the generic public. It doesn't exist. And you know, this is part of what I learned as a design student in Walter Hood's class, which is that you design for the way that people are actually using spaces, not the way that you would like people to use this space. What are people actually doing? What are the needs today that this space can fulfill? Or how can we anticipate what the needs will be 10 years from now? It's really difficult to do.
Yeah, 150.
So let's switch gears a little bit off to another topic, because we could go on about this for probably 5-6 years, and probably the design community probably will. You know, there's a lot of parks that people are excited about right now. The High Line, obviously, Seattle Olympic Park, Millennium Park, and you know, we hear a lot of, we need a High Line in our city. We need, you know, so obviously we know that all these things aren't replicable. What shouldn't you what lessons shouldn't you take from some of those, and what lessons should you take from, let's say, from something like the High Line? John, do you want to?
Well, I think, I think that's a great example of a new process of formation of a space, right? That the High Line was created because of two very vocal and committed local community activists. That wasn't a policymaker or a planner saying, hey, I've got this great idea. It emerged from, a dedicated local constituent. And I think, but you can't replicate that lesson. But I think, I think what you can do is understand that the process by which you make spaces has to be more diverse, inclusive, and robust, and offer opportunities for different levels of engagement. I mean, honestly, I feel like the traditional planning outreach process is kind of broken. It's either you've got a room full of consultants and a very small amount of community members. Not in all cases. I mean, some people can do this really well. But I can't tell you how many community meetings I've been to where there's more consultants than there are community members. It's either that, or on the other side, you have a very kind of vocal, active, professional protester kind of person who's there, who claims to speak for the community, for the public, and is really sort of, professing their own self-interest. And I think one of the ways to get around that is by doing movies. Is by trying different things, by trying different ways of engaging people in ways that they can get physical with things, they can test ideas, they can communicate in new ways that sort of invites different ways of thinking about how we shape space.
Let's hear from Tupper and Theaster about what are some of those new and innovative things that have happened in those parks that you think that are replicable, maybe the public art programs or temporary, and what are some of those specific, really cool, interesting ideas that can be translated in some way to some of the Washington parks that we're talking about. So.
Yeah, man. Well,
or if you want to respond to him, that's
fine. I'll go both ways.
Okay.
That on one level, I think that when the Conference of Mayors convenes, and the High Line is successful, and the mayor from Cincinnati says, "Well, damn, I have some elevated rail that isn't used, or I have some tracks," and I think that in a way, our cities are saying we want a High Line too, but I think they're also saying we want to be noticed. We want to be nationally recognized. We have hundreds of miles of track that are unused. We'd like to have a good design solution to all of this unused infrastructure in our cities. So the issue is that sometimes we don't have the mechanisms by which we can take the same infrastructure of our cities and do new things with it. That our capacity to innovate as cities is lessened because there are so many things to do. So you see a good thing working, and you go for it. And on one level, I think that Mayor Daley went to Paris. He saw a lot of bikes. He became excited about bikes, and then all our buses had bike racks on the front of the buses. It was awesome that it happened. It required a model because cities tend to wait and kind of see what other cities do. So I have a really kind of terse relationship because I think in some ways the replications always mutate. Sometimes they animals, public art animals and stuff like that. They mutate sometimes into every city, which is fine, which is awesome. I love public art. But I think that those models, I think that models are important.
No, it's really true. I mean, I think there's nothing better than having mayors of different cities wanting to one-up one another with a new public space infrastructure investment, right? Like investment in infrastructure in the U.S. has declined for the last 60 years. Right? And now instead of these monumental architecture pieces representing and drawing people to a city, now potentially it's becoming places like Millennium Park and the High Line. And each city wants to have that signature, landscape public space project that's going to enable them to compete with global cities for talent, for people, for new business, for economic growth and investment.
Yeah, and I think the economic development part of that is very significant. Really, Millennium might not have happened if it hadn't been for Bryant Park. So Bryant Park was a major turnaround that said this community can be a safe, fun, cool place just by redesigning this one piece of open space. And then Daley says, well, we can outdo you on that. And he does this humongous, wonderful Millennium Park. But the great thing is that each one of these parks is having its own local flavor. So Millennium is not a New York City park. It's a Chicago park. It's pretty exciting. It has a lot of fun stuff in it. It includes a lot of art works in it, which are very fun to see, and I think involve stuff. The High Line is going to get repeated in many different ways across the world as people notice that they have these thousands of miles of park. And the real issue is these are all sort of based first and foremost on economic development and not necessarily on community development. And so one of the things is, can these ideas and these wonderful things spread out into Brooklyn and Queens, or whatever your Washington D.C.'s version is of that? Will it spread into other parts of Chicago? And how do you make those open spaces that are further out from the center core and not necessarily economic development, but about community development? And how do you get your parks to be re-energized by some of these great new ideas that are coming up?
So let's go with a full-on design nerdy question. One of the big issues for any building or space that's being built right now is its environmental sustainability and sort of the environmental performance of a space. So, John, I'd love to hear you speak about how you balance achieving performance of a landscape. Some people call it landscape performance, or achieving environmental performance of a public space, and also balance the need for temporary uses and for all of those things. I mean, how are you addressing that as a designer right now?
Well, that's interesting. San Francisco recently went through a kind of open space planning process and sort of rethinking their, open space plan for the next 10 or 15 years. And the pieces in which I was involved in that was trying to integrate ideas of productive landscape into that framework, so that there would be opportunity for people to do edibles and to actually have, expand the role of community gardens. And this is nothing new, right? I mean, the Victory Garden program in the World War II era, 40% of the food that was grown in this country was produced in these small gardens. And it was an incredibly, popular community program. And I think that idea of productivity is very closely connected in landscape to ecological function. I mean, unfortunately, our sort of de facto landscape is a sort of ecological desert. Lawn and, mowed lawn and trees. It takes this incredibly intensive use, and all the sort of literate landscape designers are well aware of this. But I think landscape maintenance budgets are part of the challenge. And I think one of the ways of getting around that is bringing in programs and bringing in participation by community groups that want to activate these kind of spaces and do programs and functions that support the ecological health of the parks, like native plant gardening, like food production, right? You're getting more people in the parks. You're getting, more sort of collective maintenance effort through community stewardship, and that can lower your maintenance budget and also boost the ecological health of that space.
Tupper, you had a very prescribed Olmsted design
Yes,
park. How did you deal with
he was
this
ahead
issue?
of his time.
Of course, of course. But how did you deal with
every drop of water that falls in Prospect Park goes into cisterns and into the lake and actually forms the lake. So he was way ahead of his time because he wasn't part of the grid yet. So he had to figure out how to take care of all the water. But I think we actually do a lot more now with sustainable, using design methods that are sustainable. And the Parks Department in New York has got design standards, and we're actually even talking with the Department of Transportation and the Water Department about whether, since we're on a hill, could some of the water from the community come into cisterns that would be inside the park, and could you put them underneath? So I think some of these larger old parks are going to be able to help to handle some of that sustainability issue for the community around it, which will be a very interesting thing. But I also think it's a lot about education and educating the public more and more to understand why you do all of these things. And I think parks are a great place to do that kind of educating.
I'm glad you guys brought up the topic of urban farming, because that's certainly a trend in public space right now, and I think that there is some tension between sort of urban farming in a very formalized space versus kind of what's happening in Detroit. And I'd love to, I mean, have you worked with the issues, how are you addressing the urban farming issues kind of in the south side of Chicago right now?
Well, you know, I think that in cities where there's lots of space, where there used to be buildings, people are asking, you know, very hard questions about what should happen in those spaces. In some cases, I think that the cultivation of farms is an appropriate response to it. Other times, I don't. That I think that there are ways in which the question of sustainability or the issue of sustainability and the solution of farming just also feels like a low-hanging fruit. And that the innovation that could happen, that could also spur on new forms of economic revitalization, that we don't think about them. And so it's like, well, you know, Detroit needs corn, or Detroit could grow soy for China, or, you know, and I think that while on one level the farm is a great response, and they are in places where maybe the populations are shrinking and there's not a need for more buildings, that I think in addition to this low-hanging fruit, what other options might there be? Because what I found in these places is that often the folk who are interested in this phrase, urban farming, are very specific, kind of gentleman-esque, you know, social do-gooder. I don't want to get into this, but there's a way in which the communities that are around those neighborhoods in Detroit or whatever, that sometimes they're left out of the conversation, and you get a whole bunch of farmers from San Francisco to do the work. So in addition to the way we talk about sustainability on the side of the environment, I think that, you know, what are the implications of a kind of social sustainability? Are we being thoughtful and mindful about the people who have lived in a place, who continue to be poor in a place, or who want to live alongside all of this exciting reactivation of land and space? How do we consider them as much as we consider wind things and solar things and water things? That people are actually a part of the sustainable future of a place, and I don't think we give enough thought to them.
Well, I want you to speak about a project that you were talking about when we were back in the green room, but before that I think I had to make a PSA about questions from the crowd. If you guys have questions, please write them on your cards and pass them down to the end. Those will be collected, and we'll start those questions probably in about 10 minutes. So if you can get them down probably in the next 2 or 3 minutes, that would be absolutely fabulous. So, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the project, the Jesse Jackson project that you made.
Yes.
I just think it's a really interesting thing. So.
Well, Tupper had mentioned the Resurrect and the tents. There's been active political excitement around some of the more radical ideas of Martin Luther King. And one of those ideas had to do with the creation of these temporary spaces. And some of the political leadership in Chicago has been excited to think about these radical ideals of King being resurrected on empty lots around the city. And they asked the not-for-profit that I work with, Rebuild Foundation, if we would consider helping to build these things. And as an artist, I've been excited to kind of keep my politic neutral, and that whatever politic that I have growing, it's a politic of the work that I do that goes to museums and is gestural, or the work that I do in neighborhoods. So it was the first time that I kind of connected with a real political organization to consider how our ability to build might have radical political consequence. So design in service to a political ideology, or in complement to a political ideology. And I'm still kind of figuring it out, honestly. But what's exciting is that I think that there's a way in which our cities, our mayors, our politicians, our activist communities are understanding that the creative mind and the creative person is an active agent active flux in the dissemination of our ideals, and that maybe there's room for more designers and artists to be a part of political conversations and to maybe even create radical change in a place.
You mean creative placemaking? Sorry, plug. NEA plugs. Shameless NEA
Thank
plugs.
you, that's really good.
Like how you worked that back around. Before we get to questions from the crowd, we got to talk about it. Cities don't have money. Maintenance. And I want to talk about maintenance in permanent historic spaces, and I want to talk about maintenance for temporary parklet kind of things. So let's start with Tupper. I know it's a huge topic, but so we're talking about ideas for the future, right?
Yes.
Is it a private trust that can help pay for maintenance? What are the trends for helping with park maintenance in the future, right?
Well, there's a lot of trends. There aren't yet total solutions. But I think anytime we are building new parkland or trying to do something, you have to put in, this is the one thing I have to fault Olmsted on. He created fabulous parklands and no way to fund the long-term maintenance. And I think that we are all remiss if we don't do that, because we keep doing these great capital projects, beautiful design for every era, and then you end up at the end of the time where the park has been basically devastated by the people who love it very much. And I think that is the crux of keeping these open spaces quite wonderful. And there's a lot of creative thinking going on about this, everything from the Brooklyn Bridge Park, which was building in housing that would actually pay for the ongoing maintenance. Battery Park City in New York has done that, and that park is beautifully maintained because it's done, but the public can come and use that park at any time. So there's many ways of looking at how to do that, but the mall has clearly been really loved to death. It's an amazing space that's wonderful to see, but you just don't see it without a whole lot of people in it all the time. And that kind of thing has been left aside by government because it's a lot easier for government to give capital money and borrow, which is what it's done through bonding, as opposed to annual expense money. And so I think there's got to be much more emphasis put on that. And I think in design, you guys who do design have to really be aware of the maintenance problems of the design and what it will and can help us who are trying to maintain our parks do it better. So the sustainability certainly helps a lot, because if you can get rid of puddles, you get rid of a lot of problems and things like that, and grasses and what kinds of green grassy areas you create and how much you can use native plants in their place. So I think a lot of it can be solved by some amount of design understanding of what the maintenance problems will be. But the longer term thing is that there simply has to be more money put into our city parks to keep them going.
John, can you jump in here? And I want you to address some of the things that Tupper's talked about, but also talk about how you design, like when you've been designing parklets, how you're designing for maintenance of these kind of temporary small parks.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, one thing I want to say about temporary is that it's not meant to nor ever will replace major investment in public spaces. And unfortunately, we don't have the kind of cultural, political will to do that a lot these days. And, you know, as I've been making these temporary parks for the last 5 years, you know, I recently visited Paris and looked at some of their new spaces in streetscape, and they have, you know, granite truncated domes and brass bollards on their bike lanes, right? And in New York, all the efforts of Jeanette Sadiq-Khan and the DOT, it's paint and it's very simple. It's claiming the space, which is what these temporary things do. But you know, honestly, they'll never substitute for like, major investment in the public realm and civic space making. However, the reality is that the cities don't have the money, and so how do projects like Parklet or the Pavement to Parks project do this? Well, in the case of Parklet, it's a public-private partnership. You know, a city or a cafe owner applies for a permit. They get a permit to remove a parking space, and they can build out a little park to their, however they like to, according to some city guidelines. It's still a public space, right? It still is part of the kind of public realm network of the city. But the maintenance of that is done by the adjacent cafe owner. We can't saddle the burden of maintenance onto, the city rec and park agency or the streets agency. They just don't have the capacity. So it's about spreading that stewardship burden actually to more users. The way it's happening with some larger spaces like Mint Plaza, other of these living street models, is actually working with business improvement districts and working with folks who have a vested interest in having a great public space in their neighborhood, because they know, great public spaces is going to foster and build investment for their businesses. So those are some interesting tools, I think, that are being used lately, is working with BIDs and just reaching out and relying on broader stewardship partners.
Fantastic. I think we're almost ready for questions from the crowd.
I'm in Chicago, and we have the Friends of Everything.
Yeah, we do.
we
And you
are,
have a separate funding source.
yeah, we are friendly.
Yeah.
And
Love
I
it.
think I don't exactly know what to think of this, but if I were to compare parks to museums or parks to university institutions where a new position is created, but that position is often endowed, that when an institution decides that a new faculty post is important, they're imagining that faculty post into perpetuity, so that they don't think about the faculty post like, oh, I need $150,000 to get through the first year, or the $300,000 to attract a faculty member. They think we need $7.5 million to endow this post so that we could pay them $125,000 a year. And so I think that there has to be another way of imagining not just the granite and bollards, although that's a part of it, but the deep fiscal implications of the things that we start. So that, and it requires that there's a group of people who have wealth who are excited about the thing that we do. And if we were to just kind of accept the terms of culture today, that I make my asks from people who have money.
Yeah.
And I get people who have money to be excited about what I do, public or private, art or otherwise. And that investment allows for me to perpetuate more of this creative activity. And so I think that there has to be structures, institutional structures that and cities have to be more savvy about leveraging the resources that it has in private individuals.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to jump to some fabulous questions from our audience.
Horrible.
Here's a
Sorry.
no chitter chatter.
Sidebar.
Here's a very Washington question. Have you any thoughts as to how to respond to security concerns while maintaining citizens' access to balancing First Amendment concerns? Tupper, you've probably dealt with this.
Sure. I think that, I know this is Washington, so I don't want to, but it's, the whole security thing is really also about respect for the land and respect for the people who belong to the land. And so the policies should respect both sides of that. And so, protest people should understand that this is an important piece of land and so on. But I think the security, just for security's sake and putting a lot of physical barriers and physical things into our parks to create security is a very risky and very unpleasant activity. And so I'd be very opposed to permanent security in a park design. You'd want to have it be beautiful, but a way that somebody could, if they had to, close it off, seal it in some way, and move it away again. But temporary security is all that I'd really want to go with in a big way in a place like Washington or Prospect Park or any of these places. You can use some cameras, you can use some things like that that don't have to be, any place can be hidden away. But the reality is putting up barriers that are ugly and just defeats the whole purpose of having beautiful landscape, because it should be a place of joy and not a place of terror. So, you should be able to walk into a public space and feel warm and fuzzy and not feel like there's a big wall in front of you.
Right.
Yeah, security seems to also be part of the things you build and the horses that parade by, but also the messaging that you create and the education that happens around how to care for public space. So in thinking about like TSA and airports and that, there's been such a new reinvestment in messaging, good and bad. And, but I think that messaging has taught us how big our bottles can be when we travel, and how much water we can have, and how toothpaste. But that messaging could do so many other things if harnessed right. And I think that messaging could be as powerful as the barriers that we put up sometimes.
This is a good one for John. How do you balance design innovation and also meeting the needs of the community when designing a park space, especially when the community may not grasp some of the design concepts that you're trying to achieve? So.
Yeah, well, I think one of the ways that we've tried to engage that is through this process of iterative placemaking, actually. So not everyone understands a plan. Not everyone can read a section. But when you do a full-scale mock-up or you test something physically, it's a new way of getting feedback. It's also a way of circumventing some fears around, some big changes happening. You can sort of demonstrate the possibilities, and in doing so, kind of build interest and momentum. So I think that's part of the way that we approach it, is that you just kind of go for it. You do a physical intervention, you make a move, and then you have something to talk about.
Can I counter that a little bit? I mean, because I'm trying to be sensitive to, like, the teams of architects and designers that we have here, and it seems like people might actually have grand vision for the mall. They might have a design aesthetic that is far and above an iterative process, that they might want to say, no, actually, I want to see one sweeping line and then these two dots at the end, and that is the landscape. And so I think that there are these moments where design ambition and architectural artistic ego are in conversation, in tension with the users. And I think that tension can actually be good tension, that we should have grand ambition for what happens in the mall, especially if finally somebody's going to shake the purse and let us do something big and ambitious. But that should also be engaged in a rigorous conversation, so that if there's some education that needs to happen on the public side, to say, look, we know that these are things that maybe you've never seen before, but it's important that we have big ideas for this space. Can you think with us about them? Because I'm going to continue to have big ideas. But I think it's a wrestling. And I don't want to, that in addition to our microprocesses, I think that there are some bigger egos in this room
It's a good point.
who don't want their plans thwarted by ignorant community members who don't know shit about design.
Exactly. We're on a 5-second delay, right? All right, so that leads to the next question kind of beautifully. You're just like knocking them over to me. This is so easy tonight. I'd like to hear you answer this, Theaster. So how do you get marginalized folks involved in the planning and design stages of a parks project, not just the actual use of the space? All three of you don't.
I think Tupper,
you can jump in.
answered some of this.
Right, yeah. I think a lot of it is getting them to first really love the space and understand it better. And then, to me, it's about inviting. And everybody says, well, we put up signs and told them there was going to be a meeting, and nobody came. So I think what you really have to do is you have to go out and meet with people in the community. You have to ask them what they think, and then you have to bring them to a place where they all come to talk to each other because, Brooklyn is the biggest melting pot in the world, practically, although Washington's pretty close. But we have so many different people of so many backgrounds. So going out first and talking to your electeds, talking to the other people, who's the best person in the community to be talking to organizations, not just individuals, because very often you have the one guy who's like really obnoxious, who has one view and it's really just their view. And I think bringing people together like that and getting them involved. And I also do agree that you have to have a pretty strong design sentiment. I mean, you do need professional designers. I'm a big believer in that. And I think they can show and help people know what they want. It's like, what's his face who just died, who said the reason we have Apple is because none of you knew what you wanted and I did. You know, and so he designed stuff we would all want that we would never have thought we wanted. And so I think that's why you have professionals who think big and who have that background. But you have to also have a way of bringing your community, and certainly in the mall, it's an enormous community. It's, you know, it's the man who's head of this building, and the president and the senators and the Congress, and then it's all the kids who live around it and everything else. So how do you talk to those communities in different ways to get them to buy in is, I think, the really big issue that will be here. And I think it can totally be done, and I think can be done in an exciting way. But the landscape architects and architects who are working on this will have to have the ability to really illustrate it, to show how it would feel, to show pictures of how that works. And you try a new lamp because it's a great new lamp that you've just discovered, but nobody can maintain it. So you should show it to the guys at the Park Service who are going to have to maintain it to be sure they still can do it. So it's that kind of, the community is really looking at lots of kinds of communities and dealing with that.
I got it.
Just to build on a couple things you guys are saying. I mean, I think I agree that the big vision is important. And I think one way of getting there that I've learned is actually, not sort of putting your design in front of bureaucrats to review, but going right to the top, go right to the mayor, go right to whoever is really the one who has the decision-making power to say, I love this idea. Because when you get that person on board with a compelling vision, then it's so much easier to navigate through the processes that could otherwise be obstacles. So I think big vision is important, and also going to the people who are really in that decision-making power.
I think maybe I'll try to answer another part of the question that I hear with, that deals particularly with people. And I think I'm going to let architects off the hook. That I don't think that architects are trained to necessarily work with marginal communities. And so that architects are trained to think about space and design and buildings and space envelopes. One piece of advice is that you build into your budget people or a person that is actually expert at engaging in communities, and that you not that I think that architects might be, designers are great listeners, and great listeners especially around space, but that you're often encountering another set of politics when you're talking about marginal communities of whatever sort. That there is, it's almost like assuming that you can go to China and immediately speak Chinese just because you're a designer. That sometimes that there are different languages, and if you look at good designers who work in other places, in other countries, it seems like they first identify a local partner who really knows the terrain, and then they identify architects who can kind of speak to the social kind of infrastructure that might inform that design. And I think that in working in communities that are outside of the communities that might be familiar to you as a person, it might be worth trying to figure out space in the budget to say, how do we find people that could help us galvanize the sentiment of folk? And the way I do that is, sometimes we have the movie night at my house, and sometimes we have it in the backyard of a neighbor's house. And then I'm at the whim of their expertise about how their backyard works, and really trying to create situations where voice and agency is shared but I know my limitations. So when I have to talk to an all-white group, I sometimes bring my white interpreter to translate my gibberish into things that they might understand better.
Yeah, that's right. No, but it's
Well,
true. Exactly how we all work. It's true.
I'm just going to press all the jokes I have going in my head right now, but because we're out of time. So, but I do. Okay, so this is about the future of parks and the future of public space. You have some of the most intelligent designers sitting in the country, in the world, sitting in front of us right now. Your idea, people. In closing, what's one thing you want to leave them with as they're thinking about these unbelievably important spaces to our country on the National Mall? Easy question.
Wow.
We've talked to it a lot, but it's
Wow.
like, what's the one thing you want to say to these guys?
You know,
for them to think about as they're going through this
Yeah,
process.
ambition is important, but ambition doesn't necessarily mean permanence. The monumental doesn't necessarily mean a thing. That we remember a King's speech or a Lincoln speech or a presence, and that we think hard about how can we use our knowledge of design and architecture to evoke monumental moments that are temporary and live in the hearts of people, or permanent and live on the mall itself.
Tupper?
Wow. That's, a
That's
great
an easy
one.
act to
That's
follow.
a very good one. Let's see. I think I would say come up with great designs that work with what the mall already is. It is already a fabulous place that means a lot to the people of this country and the people of Washington. So coming up with a design that really continues the great history that the mall has, and the great feeling we all have when we go to the mall of sort of patriotism and excitement, and the excitement of the old days, but the excitement of the days to come. So I think that just continuing that tradition of the mall in a better and better maintained way is great.
Wow, what can I add to that? Those are brilliant comments. What came up for me was the idea of being comfortable with embracing uncertainty and embracing mystery, and giving yourself some time to tap into what is a source of kind of intuition for you and inspiration. You may have already a well-developed design process, but I think by adding diverse voices to the table and actually giving yourself some time to settle into what is your source of inspiration, embracing mystery and uncertainty, you can reach outcomes that you wouldn't otherwise be able to reach.
Thank you all so much. Let's have a huge round of applause for our panel. I think all of us are going to exit stage left, and I'd like to now turn the program back to Caroline Cunningham with the Trust for the National Mall. So I think we'll just go that way.
Thank you all, and a round of applause. Jason, thank you for doing such a great job. I just think that this is an extraordinary place to be for this conversation, and I was late coming down here because I think I was spending time looking at the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence, and it's very suiting that's where we started tonight. I just want to also thank Marcel, Acosta, Julia, Stephen, Bill at National Capital Planning Commission. They were really the team with Daniel Rojo from my staff pulling this together, and I truly appreciate your help. I want to acknowledge my former board member at the City Parks Alliance, and Catherine Nagel, who is here with the City Parks Alliance as well, in putting this evening together. I'm really fascinated by that discussion, and I think what was resounding for me were two things. One is the need for partnership and the need for public involvement. I love the idea of flash experiences, flash spaces, and how that fits in and integrating those with the enduring symbols of the National Mall, which are so important. I want to say that this is a beginning of a dialogue that the City Parks Alliance will be continuing in New York in July. It is going to be held on the 14th through the 17th. It's called the 2012 International Urban Parks Conference, and I hope that you will go to urbanparks2012.org and join us at that important dialogue. I will talk just briefly about the design competition. We are in the third stage, so the people who are here tonight, not only the public, but the designers, are the finalists, the best in the country, who are going to be focusing on the future of the National Mall. Don Statsny has helped me articulate that cities are really being determined by what the public realm is. And it is parks that are spaces, but also not only the grand spaces, but the in-between spaces and how people interact with those. And I think that that's very important as we design the future of the National Mall. How do we make it both an important space and continue its excellence and grandeur, but also make it personal and touching and meaningful to the 25 million people who come every year. For me, that gives us a sense of identity, a sense of ownership of these enduring symbols while having a place to go and be excited about. Just in closing, I know that where you start with the program and where the trust would like designers to go is to inspire us. Truly inspire us. People across this country are looking to be inspired by what you do, and generations to come will be touched by what you create in the future. And I know that everyone here tonight shares with me the excitement about the next phase of the National Mall design competition through the Trust for the National Mall. In April, we get to see what you're going to design, and the public will get to share that. And then we will make the winning announcements on the 3rd of May, and I hope you will be with us at that time as well. So thank you for coming tonight. I hope that you will stay involved in this dialogue that we want to create. I was writing on local connections, national dialogue, because I think that that's so important to this space. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in April.